There is a sacred fire that lives inside every human being, a fire born not from comfort or praise, but from pain. Pain is not your punishment, it is your purification. It is the alchemy through which your raw humanity transforms into unshakable strength. The mind resists it, the heart fears it, but the soul understands it, because pain, when faced with awareness, does not destroy. It dissolves everything that is not real within you. It burns away illusions, dependencies, false attachments, and identities that were never truly yours. You see, pain has always been misunderstood. We are taught to run from it, to suppress it, to mask it with distractions, achievements, relationships, or even spiritual bypassing. But pain is not meant to be avoided. It is meant to be entered. It is a sacred teacher that speaks a language beyond logic, a language that can only be felt. When life wounds you, it is not trying to break you down, it is trying to awaken you. It is showing you where you have built your foundation on something fragile, something external, something temporary. When you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what is this trying to teach me? The transformation begins. You start to see that pain is not chaos, it is coded with meaning. Every heartbreak carries a revelation. Every betrayal carries liberation. Every loss carries a message that whispers, you are not what you lost. What you truly are can never be taken. What you truly are cannot be destroyed. The fire only consumes what is false. Pain becomes alchemical the moment you stop running from it and start meeting it with presence. The moment you allow it to move through you, without resistance, it begins to shift form. The ache that once hollowed you becomes the space that receives wisdom. The tears that once fell in despair begin to water the soil of self-realization. The darkness you once feared becomes the womb from which your light is born. What was once the weight that buried you becomes the ground from which you rise. There is no spiritual growth without pain. There is no awakening without friction. You cannot become who you are meant to be without dying to who you once were. Pain is that sacred death, the burning away of the old self. It demands surrender. It demands silence. It demands that you face everything you've avoided. It strips you bare of all pretenses and false strength, leaving you naked in front of your own truth. And in that raw exposure, something magnificent happens. You discover the indestructible essence that was always there beneath the wounds. True healing does not come from escaping pain, it comes from understanding it. Every time you resist your pain, you add another layer of suffering. Every time you meet it with compassion, you free yourself a little more. The alchemy of pain requires patience. It cannot be rushed or manipulated. It unfolds in its own rhythm, like the slow cooling of molten gold after the fire. You must trust that beneath the agony, something precious is being formed, something that will shine with the brilliance of wisdom, resilience, and self-respect. The soul is like a blacksmith. It forges strength in the furnace of suffering. Each hardship hammers your character, shapes your awareness, and tempers your spirit. The fire may rage, but it never destroys the core metal. It only removes the impurities. The more intense the heat, the purer the gold. The deeper the wound, the greater the wisdom waiting to emerge from it. Pain is also a mirror. It reflects back to you everything you have ignored, suppressed, or denied. It reveals where you have abandoned yourself, where you have tolerated too little love, where you have mistaken comfort for peace. It does not come to harm you. It comes to reunite you with yourself. When you allow the pain to speak, it will tell you what needs to be released, what needs to be forgiven, and what needs to be reclaimed. You cannot be broken by what you understand. Pain loses its power when it becomes understood. When you say, I see you, to your pain. When you stop running from the memories, from the voices, from the loneliness, you step into your power. You become the observer instead of the victim. You become the alchemist instead of the sufferer. You begin to transform pain into insight, wounds into wisdom, and endings into beginnings. This transformation is not loud. It doesn't come with applause or recognition. It happens in silence, in those quiet nights when your soul finally exhales and whispers, I survived. It happens in the stillness after the tears, in the calm that follows the chaos. It happens when you realize you no longer need to be rescued because you have learned how to rescue yourself. The alchemy of pain teaches you that your worth is not defined by how untouched you are, but by how deeply you have felt and still chosen to love. It teaches you that scars are not symbols of defeat, but of endurance. Each scar is a line of poetry written by the fire that could not destroy you. They are proof that you walked through the darkness and came out carrying light. Pain transforms you from fragile into fearless. It dismantles every illusion that made you dependent on others for your sense of peace. It reveals that peace was never outside, it was always waiting within. Pain forces you inward, back to your own center, back to your own soul. It breaks the illusion of control, but in doing so, it gives you the only real control there is, mastery over yourself. In that mastery, pain becomes sacred. You stop resenting it, and you start revering it. You begin to understand that without pain, you would never have met your own strength. Without loss, you would never have discovered your capacity for love. Without darkness, you would never have learned how to create light. Pain is not your enemy, it is your evolution in disguise. It is the fire that turns suffering into strength, confusion into clarity, and wounds into wisdom. It is the silent sculptor of your soul, carving you into the person you were always meant to become. There comes a point in every soul's journey when surrender no longer means weakness and silence no longer means defeat. It is the moment you stop fighting the world outside and begin reclaiming the world within. The battles that once exhausted you were never against others. They were against your own fears, your own illusions, and your own forgotten strength. The inner warrior is not born in peace, but in the fire of pain, betrayal, and transformation. When everything you depended on collapses, when every illusion falls away, what rises from the ashes is not the same version of you. It is the version that remembers who you truly are. The warrior within does not wear armor made of anger or pride. It wears armor made of awareness. This is not the kind of strength that shouts or competes. It is the kind that stands still in chaos and refuses to be moved. It is the quiet, unwavering energy that says, I have already faced the worst, and I am still here. The return of the inner warrior is not about learning how to fight again, but about remembering that you no longer need to fight to prove your worth. The battle is not out there, it is in your own mind. It is between the voice that tells you you're not enough and the one that whispers that you always have been. The inner warrior rises when you stop seeking validation from those who cannot see your light. It rises when you stop explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. It rises when you stop begging for love that requires you to shrink. You begin to realize that peace is not given to you by others. It is reclaimed from within yourself. The true warrior doesn't seek revenge or dominance. They seek mastery. Mastery over emotion, reaction, and perception. Every attack becomes a lesson. Every setback becomes a training ground. Every disappointment becomes a mirror showing where strength still sleeps. The inner warrior learns the art of response over reaction. It understands that real power doesn't need to defend itself. It simply exists. When you are centered, when your mind and soul are aligned, no insult, betrayal, or rejection can penetrate your peace. You stop swinging at shadows. You stop needing to prove that you are strong because your strength has already been tested by survival. You have walked through the fires that once terrified you, and in doing so, you have become fire. Once, you may have mistaken love for sacrifice and silence for weakness. But the warrior within knows that self-respect is not negotiable. It no longer bends for those who take without giving, or stays where its soul is starved. It draws boundaries not from bitterness, but from balance. It knows that protecting your energy is not selfish, it is sacred. It knows that walking away is not giving up, it is rising higher. The return of the inner warrior means reclaiming your right to choose yourself without apology. You stop fearing solitude, because solitude is where the warrior sharpens their spirit. You learn to enjoy your own company because you no longer seek others to fill the void. You realize that solitude is not loneliness. It is communion with your own soul. It is in that sacred space that you hear the whispers of your intuition, the wisdom of your higher self, and the voice of the warrior reminding you that peace is your natural state. The warrior does not run from pain. They walk through it with open eyes. They know that every heartbreak carved out more space for compassion. Every betrayal strengthened discernment. Every failure taught humility. The warrior knows that life is not meant to be easy. It is meant to be meaningful. And meaning is found not in comfort, but in courage. The courage to face truth. The courage to say no. The courage to release what no longer serves your growth. When the warrior returns, you stop being afraid of endings. You start seeing them as initiations. You understand that destruction is often the first step of creation. You no longer cling to people or situations that drain you, because you have learned that what falls away is never a loss, it is a clearing. The inner warrior does not chase, it attracts. It does not beg, it embodies. It does not fight for love, it becomes love. The warrior within is not fueled by ego, it is guided by purpose. It doesn't seek to conquer others, but to conquer the self. It is disciplined in thought, intentional in action, and rooted in awareness. It knows when to speak and when silence is the louder statement. It knows when to strike and when to step back. It understands that not every battle is worth fighting, and not every opinion deserves energy. The inner warrior moves with precision, not impulsiveness, with wisdom, not rage. In your return to your inner warrior, you begin to see that strength and softness are not opposites, they are complements. The warrior knows when to stand firm and when to surrender. It knows that forgiveness is not weakness, but freedom. It understands that compassion is not naivety, but clarity. It recognizes that power without love becomes tyranny, but love without power becomes self-destruction. The balance of both is what makes the warrior divine. You stop living in survival mode and start living in awareness mode. You are no longer triggered by the same things that once shook you. You no longer rush to explain yourself or to be understood. You realize that silence is not emptiness, it is mastery. You learn that sometimes the greatest act of strength is not to fight harder, but to walk away lighter. The warrior's heart beats not for conquest, but for peace. But that peace is not passive. It is earned. It is built through nights of doubt, through moments of surrender, through the decision to rise again when every part of you wants to give up. It is the peace that says, I trust the timing of my life. I trust the wisdom of my wounds. I trust the strength of my soul. The return of the inner warrior is the moment you reclaim your power from everything that once made you feel powerless. It is when you stop waiting for rescue and remember that you have always been the one who saves yourself. When the inner warrior returns, you no longer ask for the path to be easy. You ask for the strength to walk it with grace. You no longer fear the darkness. You move through it with light in your eyes and truth in your heart. You remember that no one can take away what you have found within yourself. You have faced every storm, and through each one, you discovered that you were not meant to be broken. There comes a moment when the narrative that once defined your life begins to crumble. The story of being wronged, betrayed, or forgotten. It is the identity built on wounds, on memories that never seem to heal, on the quiet ache of injustice that never received closure. For so long, you carried the weight of what happened to you, believing it shaped who you are. But the truth is far more powerful. What happened to you was only the fire that revealed who you were always meant to become. The death of the victim is not the denial of pain, it is the transcendence of it. It is the moment when your suffering no longer defines your destiny. For years, you may have lived in the echoes of old wounds, repeating the stories of betrayal and disappointment until they became part of your identity. Every conversation, every decision, every relationship filtered through the lens of what they did to me. You began to see yourself as someone who must survive rather than someone who can create. But survival is not living, it is existing. The victim mindset keeps you trapped in survival, replaying the past in a loop of unconscious pain. It makes you believe you are powerless, that life is happening to you, not through you. The death of the victim begins when you realize that the power you gave to others, the power to define you, to hurt you, to limit you, was never theirs to hold. You begin to see that the only real prison was the belief that you were trapped. What you thought was oppression was often perception. The world did not conspire against you. Your mind did. Every unhealed wound became a lens distorting your reality, every painful memory a wall, separating you from your strength. But once awareness enters, the illusion dissolves. To release the victim within, you must face the truth without denial or defense. You must look at your pain not as evidence of unfairness, but as the initiation into consciousness. The victim says, "Why me?" But the awakened soul asks, "What is this teaching me?" That single shift in perception changes everything. It is the death of the old self that needed sympathy and the birth of the new self that embodies sovereignty. You no longer need to be rescued. You remember that you were never powerless to begin with. The victim mind feeds on blame. It needs an enemy to sustain its identity. But blame, no matter how justified, keeps you bound to the very energy that hurt you. It ties your growth to their behavior. your healing to their apology, your peace to their absence. When you stop blaming, you are not excusing what happened. You are reclaiming your energy from it. You are saying, I will no longer let this define me. You are stepping out of reaction and into creation. The death of the victim is a sacred death, a dismantling of the old stories that once felt safe, because even pain can become familiar. Even suffering can feel comfortable when it gives you a sense of identity. That is why many cling to their wounds. They fear who they will be without them. But liberation requires letting go of even the familiar pain. You must become brave enough to live without the old narrative, to no longer introduce yourself through your scars, but through your strength. The victim mind thrives on waiting for closure, for apologies, for validation, for justice. But the warrior within knows that waiting is a trap. Closure is not given, it is created. Justice is not always external, it is internal balance. Validation is not found in others, it is found in truth. The death of the victim happens the moment you decide that your healing will not depend on anyone else's actions. You stop waiting for them to change and start evolving yourself. You stop looking back at the locked door and start noticing the open one in front of you. You begin to recognize that even the people who hurt you were playing roles in your awakening, that every betrayal was a lesson in boundaries, every rejection a lesson in self-worth, every heartbreak a lesson in detachment. The victim says, they broke me. The awakened self says, they showed me where I was breakable. And in that awareness, you become unbreakable. You realize that life has not been unfair, it has been precise. Every experience was perfectly designed to show you where your power was hidden. The death of the victim is not a loud transformation. It happens quietly in the moment you choose peace over revenge, silence over defense, forgiveness over resentment. It happens when you stop explaining your pain to those who cannot understand it. It happens when you finally say, enough. I will not carry this story any longer. You begin to rewrite the narrative not with bitterness, but with clarity. You start to see yourself not as the wounded one, but as the awakened one who has walked through fire and remembered the way home. When the victim dies, something beautiful is born: accountability. Accountability is the highest form of self-respect. It is the understanding that while you did not choose what hurt you, you do choose how you respond to it. It is the moment you take full ownership of your emotions, your reactions, and your energy. You stop giving your power to the past and start using it to build your future. You stop asking for healing and start becoming the healer. This transformation requires courage. The courage to face your pain without identifying with it, to see your past without drowning in it, to forgive without forgetting the lesson. The death of the victim is not about erasing memory. It is about freeing yourself from its emotional gravity. It is about acknowledging the truth without letting it define your identity. You stop calling yourself broken because you finally see that you were never broken. You were only breaking open. The moment you stop living as the victim, you begin to live as the creator. You stop repeating old cycles because you have learned their lesson. You stop attracting chaos because your energy no longer vibrates with it. You stop needing others to validate your worth because you have tasted the freedom of self-trust. The death of the victim is the rebirth of sovereignty, the sacred remembering that you are not a result of what happened to you, but of what you chose to become after it. You stop needing to prove your strength. Your silence speaks it. You stop trying to convince others of your truth. Your presence radiates it. You no longer wear your pain as identity, but as wisdom. And in that shift, the past loses its power, the wounds lose their voice, and you return to the purest truth, that you were never meant to remain broken. There comes a time when you finally look into the mirror and no longer see someone desperate to be chosen, understood, or saved. You see someone who has walked through rejection, betrayal, and abandonment, and still stands. You see someone who once believed that love meant sacrifice, but now understands that real love begins with boundaries. The mirror of self-respect does not reflect perfection, it reflects truth. It shows you who you've become after shedding every version of yourself that begged for less than you deserved. Self-respect is the moment your soul remembers its worth after being forgotten in the noise of others' expectations. It is the voice that rises after you've been silenced for too long. The quiet but powerful realization that peace is more important than approval. When you look into that mirror, you begin to see that self-respect is not arrogance, it is alignment. It is the recognition that your energy, your time, and your love are sacred currencies, and you will no longer spend them where they are not valued. For too long, you may have been conditioned to mistake tolerance for kindness and endurance for strength. You may have believed that the patience meant staying silent while others crossed your boundaries. But the mirror of self-respect shows the truth, that the version of you who tolerated disrespect was not kind, but afraid of being alone, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of losing what never truly belonged to you. The moment you face that truth, the illusion shatters. You no longer confuse love with attachment or peace with avoidance. You begin to see that what you called loyalty was often self-abandonment in disguise. Self-respect begins with one powerful decision. I will no longer betray myself to keep others comfortable. That single choice changes everything. It is the turning point where you stop explaining your boundaries and start embodying them. You stop defending your worth and start living it. The mirror no longer shows someone trying to earn acceptance. It shows someone who already accepts themselves. You start realizing that people's inability to value you says more about their blindness than your brilliance. The mirror of self-respect teaches that solitude is not punishment, it is purification. When you start choosing peace over company, you begin to notice how much noise you once allowed in your life. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes sacred space. You learn to listen to your own voice again, the one that whispers truth beneath the chaos of opinions. In that stillness, you realize that you don't need validation to feel worthy. Your worth is not negotiable. It exists regardless of who sees it or fails to. True self-respect is not built in moments of comfort, but in moments of confrontation. When you must stand alone for your truth, even when it costs you connection. It is when you refuse to be guilted into shrinking. It is when you say no without explaining why. It is when you choose yourself even when it breaks someone else's expectations. The mirror reflects your strength, not through defiance, but through dignity. You stop shouting for recognition because your silence has become more powerful than your words. Self-respect does not come from pride, but from clarity. It is the understanding that you can love people deeply and still walk away when they refuse to meet you with the same respect. It is the ability to forgive without returning, to care without being consumed, to give without losing yourself. The mirror shows you that saying no is not rejection. It is redirection towards something aligned with your worth. Every no you speak from integrity becomes a declaration of self-trust. Every boundary you set becomes an act of self-love disguised as discipline. The journey to self-respect often begins in heartbreak. It begins when you realize that begging for love only leads to losing yourself. It begins when you finally get tired of trying to prove your value to those who never saw it. Pain becomes the teacher that shows you what self-neglect looks like. And as you rise from those lessons, you begin to see how every time you compromised your truth, you dimmed your own light. The mirror reflects not just who you are now, but everything you had to unlearn to become it. Self-respect means you no longer chase closure. You create it. You no longer wait for apologies. You outgrow the need for them. You no longer seek to be chosen. You realize you have already chosen yourself. The mirror no longer reflects a wounded soul waiting to be seen. It reflects a sovereign being who has become whole without permission. You stop measuring your value through someone else's eyes and start measuring it through your own peace. When you embody self-respect, your energy changes. The same situations that once drained you no longer hold power over you. The same people who once manipulated you no longer have access to your peace. You begin to see how much of your suffering came from trying to convince others to see your worth when the real work was simply remembering it yourself. The mirror becomes a teacher, showing you that when you raise your standards, you also raise your vibration, and what no longer aligns begins to fall away effortlessly. There is a quiet power in self-respect. It doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't scream for attention. It simply walks away from what disturbs its peace. It knows that not every battle is worth fighting, and not every opinion needs to be addressed. Self-respect is when you stop being reactive and start being selective. You learn that protecting your energy is not selfish. It is sacred maintenance of your spirit. You learn that distance is not coldness, it is clarity. Self-respect transforms your relationships, your decisions, and your presence. You begin to attract what reflects your energy, not what tests it. You no longer tolerate the half-hearted because you have learned to live wholeheartedly. You no longer settle for crumbs because you know the banquet is within you. The mirror of self-respect no longer shows someone who needs to be validated, but someone who embodies value. The most powerful reflection is when you look into the mirror and see someone who no longer flinches at their own truth. Someone who no longer apologizes for their strength or minimizes their light to make others comfortable. Someone who has learned that peace is the highest form of success. The mirror of self-respect shows the transformation of a soul that once begged to be seen and now stands unshaken, radiating from within, needing nothing but its own acknowledgement. There is a moment in life when everything you once believed to be solid begins to dissolve. Your identity, your attachments, your desires, your sense of control, the structures that once gave meaning suddenly collapse, and what remains is silence. This silence is not emptiness, it is the womb of rebirth. It is in that stillness where the soul begins to remember itself. The rebirth of the soul does not come from effort, but from surrender. It is not something you chase. It is something that awakens when you finally stop running from yourself. The soul's rebirth often begins in darkness. It starts when everything you thought you needed begins to fall away, when the masks you wore for survival begin to crumble. You no longer recognize the person you pretended to be, the one who lived to please, to perform, to be approved of. That version of you begins to die quietly, not in tragedy, but in truth. The death of the false self is not destruction, it is liberation. You are not losing yourself, you are shedding what was never truly you. The human ego resists this process because it craves familiarity. It clings to old identities, old narratives, old pains, anything that gives the illusion of control. But the soul is not interested in control, it is interested in freedom. When the old self begins to dissolve, the soul rejoices even as the mind panics. The confusion, the emptiness, the disorientation, they are not signs of failure, they are signs that the soul is being reborn. You are being emptied so that truth can fill you. Rebirth is not loud. It does not arrive with fireworks or applause. It arrives in quiet realizations, in moments of stillness, where you finally exhale after years of holding your breath. It comes when you stop needing to be understood, when you no longer chase meaning, but allow it to unfold naturally. The rebirth of the soul happens when you begin to see that every ending was never punishment. It was preparation. Every loss was never cruelty. It was alignment. Every heartbreak was never the death of love. It was the rebirth of your capacity to love more consciously. The old self is built from fear, the fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of being unseen. It builds walls to feel safe. But those walls also become prisons. When the soul awakens, it begins to dismantle everything built from fear. It demands authenticity. It demands that you stop living as a character and start living as consciousness. This process is not comfortable. You will grieve versions of yourself that once felt essential. You will mourn identities that once defined you. But every release is sacred. Every letting go is an initiation into truth. Rebirth is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who you were before the world taught you to forget. The soul was never lost. It was only buried beneath layers of conditioning, trauma, and expectation. The more you strip away, the more you return to essence. And in that essence, you find peace, not because life has become easier, but because you are no longer at war with it. The soul no longer resists what is, it flows with it. It learns to see through the eyes of presence, to witness rather than control, to experience rather than possess. As the soul awakens, the meaning of pain transforms. You stop asking, why did this happen to me? And start asking, what is this awakening within me? You realize that suffering was never meant to destroy you, but to crack the shell of illusion. The darkness was never the absence of light. It was the place where light was reborn. The rebirth of the soul teaches that every shadow holds wisdom, every loss holds renewal, and every silence holds divine conversation. The process of rebirth demands trust. Trust in the unseen, trust in the unfolding, trust in the intelligence of life itself. You begin to see that nothing in your path has been random. The people who left, the failures that humbled you, the pain that broke you, all of it was orchestrated by the deeper self to awaken your remembrance. The rebirth of the soul is not an external journey, but an inward one. It is the realization that what you were seeking outside was always waiting within. When the soul begins to awaken, your priorities shift. You no longer crave attention, you crave authenticity. You no longer chase success, You crave meaning. You no longer seek to be right. You seek to be at peace. You start valuing energy over appearances, intention over image, truth over comfort. You become less reactive, more aware. You stop needing to win and start needing to understand. This quiet evolution is the hallmark of soul rebirth, the transformation from ego consciousness to higher awareness. You begin to notice how much energy was wasted trying to hold together what was meant to fall apart. You see how every collapse was grace in disguise, clearing space for something real to emerge. The soul's rebirth is an act of divine intelligence, burning away everything false until only authenticity remains. It is the purification of identity, the remembering of truth. You no longer identify with the pain. You identify with the presence that observes it. You no longer cling to outcomes. You trust the unfolding. You no longer need to control others. You master yourself. In rebirth, forgiveness becomes natural. You no longer carry resentment toward those who hurt you because you understand that they, too, were lost in their illusions. You no longer carry guilt for your past because you see that every version of you was necessary for awakening. You stop seeing life as a series of random events and start seeing it as a continuous unfolding of consciousness through you. Every breath becomes sacred. Every moment becomes alive with meaning. The soul reborn is no longer afraid of death, not physical death, but the death of identities, attachments, and illusions. It understands that endings are simply transitions, that to be reborn, something must always be released. The more you surrender, the lighter you become. The lighter you become, the freer you feel. Freedom is not escape, it is alignment with truth. The rebirth of the soul is the return to that truth, the remembrance that you were never broken, never lost, never separate. You were only asleep to your own divine wholeness, and now the soul remembers itself through the ashes of all that once kept it asleep